We just heard from Oliver Dowden talking about the government's policy on Rwanda. He said he doesn't relish any of it, but the government is being forced to do it because of the increasing number of small boats crossing the channel. Is that fair enough?
Well, forced to do what? Everyone accepts that this is a major problem. It's a crisis. We've got record number of boats arriving on the coast, criminal gangs profiting, and an asylum system in chaos. But the question is, what is the government actually doing? So far, they've done several PR opportunities and photo ops. We've had £140 million of cheques written to Rwanda in order to implement a scheme that hasn't removed a single person. This is just more stunts from this government. What they should be doing is what Labour's been calling for a very long time. Take the money that is being spent on this unethical, unworkable scheme and put it into the National Crime Agency to create a cross-border cell in order to disrupt the criminal gangs who are profiting from people's misery. That will be the best way to stop the small boats and back it up with proper resources at the front end of the asylum system so that we can process cases swiftly and get a grip on what has become an unwieldy system that is completely out of control.
You know what, that would be the best thing to do if we were living in a perfect world. But the fact is we're really not. If it was that easy to stop the smuggling gangs, you'd see other countries in the world doing it. You know, Interpol themselves are saying how difficult it is. They're not like usual organised crime because of the transient nature of their relationships with their victims. You know, burner phones, they often don't know their real names. You know, Labour could say that it wants to wave a magic wand and just smash the smuggling gangs, but that's not a serious solution.
I don't think that diverting resources into setting up a specialist National Crime Agency cell is waving a magic wand. What it's doing is the hard yards that this government hasn't been prepared to do to tackle what is a very challenging criminal problem that is exploiting some of the most desperate people in the world, people who are fleeing war, who are fleeing persecution, are leaving such desperate circumstances that unless we do roll up our sleeves and do the hard yards to deal with the problem at source, the conditions that they're fleeing, to deal with an asylum system that leaves people languishing for months and often years waiting for a decision, to deal with criminal gangs who have ruthlessly exploited the fact that this government has refused to get a grip on the problem, has refused to work constructively with other countries in order to do so. Unless we do that, we're going to see what we've seen for the last decade, which is this problem continue to get worse and worse. The bill is going up, the waiting times are going up, the number of boats are going up. Since the Prime Minister said he was going to get a grip on this and legislate to stop it last year, we've seen the number of boat crossings reach record highs, 45,000 last year. The government continues to make promises, big talk and photo opportunities, but what we're calling for is precisely the action that you talked about, Sophie, not a magic wand, not a silver bullet, but real work to tackle these gangs, to tackle this problem, and to make sure that where we do offer people sanctuary, we can do so swiftly and humanely and restore Britain's reputation in the world again.
I also put some of Suella Braverman's language to Oliver Dowden, saying that it's the kind of language that Gary Lineker likened to that used in 1930s Germany. He said that that was an appalling comparison by the Match of the Day presenter. Is it? Well, look, I think what people say Gary Lineker said is very different from what Gary Lineker actually said. The government has been keen to say that he was likening this to the Nazis, that he wasn't, and I would have utterly condemned that had he done so. I don't think he would have done so, frankly. What he was pointing to was a chilling comparison with an environment in which people aren't free to be able to challenge this sort of language and behaviour. Don't forget it was Suella Braverman who used really inhumane language about the migrant crisis, which was roundly condemned not just by people outside of politics, but by people across the political spectrum, including some of her own colleagues. All of this comes back to the same problem, that the government's policies, their answers and solutions, their language is getting increasingly more outlandish because they're not prepared to do the work to actually disrupt the criminal gangs, to speed up the asylum process and to work with other countries to deal with the problems that refugees are fleeing, which is creating instability around the world. Now, Rishi Sunak came to office saying that he was going to start focusing down on cleaning up some of his own mess. This is one area where we need far less posturing, far less dangerous talk and far more real action to deal with what has been a real problem, and Labour has been saying so for a very long time.
I want to talk to you about Brexit, because of course there will be the vote next week on the Windsor framework. Oliver Dowden says he's confident that will pass, not least, of course, because Labour is expected to back it. Do you think it's a good deal for Northern Ireland?
Look, I think it's a step forward, and we will support a step forward. As I said a moment ago, Rishi Sunak is prepared to go and start cleaning up some of his own mess. We're certainly not going to criticise him for that. And there's no question that this is something that is now urgent. It's incredibly important. And trying to remove some of that friction, some of those barriers on the island of Ireland has long been our priority. We think the government ought to get on with it. We hope that vote passes, and we hope that Britain can now start to look to the future after 13 long years of drift and decay under this Tory government. This was budget week. This should have been the moment where Britain got onto the front foot and started leading the world, not leaving it, started winning the race for good jobs to get money back into people's pockets, started prioritising most people in most parts of the country, not just a handful of the wealthiest in a few parts of the country. And instead, here we still are talking about the Tory failures of the past and how we're going to fix them. We just think Britain could do so much better than this.
Talking about how you think Britain should do better, you, of course, are the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. You want to see more devolution. Now, that sounds great, of course, giving more power to local communities across the country. But I just wonder, in practice, you know, if you look at what is happening in local authorities, in councils, Croydon's gone bust, Woking, Slough, Thurrock, Warrington, just a few in financial difficulties. You know, anyone who's had any dealings with their actual local council might be thinking, hang on, you want them to do more?
Well, actually, the pandemic paints a very different story. When the national system just couldn't respond, the government reluctantly handed over the right to run test, trace and isolate systems and other the rollout of the vaccine to local authorities, to public health directors and to communities. And we responded. We stepped forward and ran effective systems in every part of the country, including Greater Manchester, where I'm sitting now, when the national system just simply couldn't do it, because we know our own communities, we know the assets and the potential that exist in those communities, not just the problems that Whitehall is keen to focus on, and we were able to mobilise people in order to get the vaccine rolled out in record time and to get test, trace and isolate up and running. 13 years of Tory government has meant that councils are reeling. They've had 15 billion cut from their budgets over that time. And in this budget, buried in the detail of this budget, was a £6 billion council tax bombshell. Essentially, the government is forcing councils to put up council tax in order to fund the services that currently exist, because the national government has stepped out of the picture. But we believe that this country could do far, far better if we actually trusted our local businesses and our local communities to take charge of their own destiny. The government says that they're in favour of doing that, but in this week's budget, which should have been a game changer, they introduced devolution deals that cover just 9% of the population. What about the missing 90% of us? We deserve far better than to be treated by this government as second-class citizens on a second-class track, to be able to unshackle ourselves from 13 years of Tory failure and start to grow our economies and get money back into people's pockets again.
Thank you very much indeed. Lisa Nandy there speaking to us from Sophy.
Thank you.